Hello, my name is Kelly Prusek, and my presentation is on Fidel Castro and his rise to power, and my research question being, how did Cuba's political climate after 1898 contribute to Fidel Castro's ascendancy by the 1950s, and what made his revolutionary ideology appealing to the Cuban people? I'm going to start off in 1492 when Spain colonizes Cuba. This begins the long reign of Spanish power and control over Cuba. It is important to note that 1492 was when Christopher Columbus came over and was most likely the reason for this colonization. We now will talk about the 10 Years' War, which lasted from 1868 to 1878, and this was the first major movement and sign of Cuba wanting independence from Spain. Although it wasn't successful, Cuba still fought for years and years after this, as we will see throughout my presentation, for their independence from Cuba. The next thing is when the USS Maine explodes in February of 1898. This was a prized U.S. ship banked at Havana, which is the capital of Cuba. It killed 266 out of 354 people. And as that newspaper article says, the U.S. blames this on Spain when most likely it was an internal engine failure. And the U.S. tried to make Spain the enemy by spreading the quote, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." The next important thing is March 17, 1898, when U.S. Senator Proctor visits Cuba. He came back with reports of Cuba in, quote, "dissolution and distress, misery and starvation." From Heraclides and Diala 205, he reported that the chance of Cuban autonomy failed, that Cuba is being reconcentrated by Spain, and it referred to Spanish rule as barbaric. And that picture on the left is a starving patient in a Cuban hospital, much like Senator Proctor would have reported on. The next thing is March 27, 1898, when the U.S. makes a final peace proposal to Spain. The U.S. felt the need to intervene in Cuba and saw it as humanitarian. They asked Spain for Cuban independence and the end of reconcentration, and the failure to reach compromise about this leads to the Spanish-American War. And the picture on the left is a Cuban cemetery of bones of people they lost during reconcentration. Like I just mentioned, the Spanish-American War then started from April of 1898 to October of 1898. This was originally started because Spain declared the war, but it was fought between Spain and U.S., and Cuba was a significant part of the war. It resulted in the U.S. declaring Cuba's freedom from Spain. The next thing is the Platt Amendment, which lasted from June 12, 1901 to 1934. And it was a, quote, agreement between U.S. and Cuba saying that Cuba is independent, but the U.S. can intervene at any time for, quote, the preservation of Cuban independence, from Heraclides and Diala 211. This was much less of an agreement versus the U.S. saying, here, we helped you win your independence, this is how you're going to repay us. Cuba had absolutely no say in post-war decisions, including this amendment, and the U.S. saw Cuba as ungrateful and unable to govern themselves, seen as objects, and was referenced as, quote, can't have another Haiti, referring to people of color of Cuba trying to gain power and the U.S. not liking that. We will now talk about Cuba entering World War I, which happened April 7, 1917, right after the U.S. did. This was in support of the U.S., and Cuba saw it as repaying the favor for U.S. helping with the Spanish-American War. Also, Fulgencio Batista became a significant political figure from 1933 to 1958. He ended up being president from 1940 to 44 and had his regime from 1952 to 58. He was a U.S.-backed dictator who used violence to stay in power. He was also referred to as the architect, meaning he had a big role in politics over the years and to form Cuba into what it was. He ended up forming a populist state and went from a military dictator to a Cuban democracy. The next thing is 1944, when Cuba renames the Spanish-American War the Spanish-Cuban-American War. This was another major step in Cuba reclaiming democracy for winning their independence, and it shows how frustrated they were growing with the U.S. taking credit for everything. The view of the revisionists was that Cuba already won the war against Spain, and U.S. came in last minute to steal all the glory and credit, which is probably the motivation behind them trying to retake back the war name and everything. The next thing we're going to discuss is July 26, 1958, which was the Movement and Manifesto program from Fidel Castro. This was a socialist movement where he spoke out against the U.S. and calls U.S. involvement a, quote, cruel deception. Much like the view I just told you, where they saw the US coming in last minute to steal all of their glory. On December 2nd, 1956, Castro and his 80 followers invade Western Cuba with the use of guerrilla warfare. This was, again, a socialist revolution against Batista, and although this was unsuccessful with 68 of 80 of the soldiers dying, his battle did not end here. The next thing is January 1st, 1959, Batista flees Cuba and then Castro takes over. He leads with a platform as a, quote, democratic political reformer interested in reforming integrity, dignity, and clean elections to the Cuban people. From Paul 109. This is the beginning of him taking power over Cuba. And then we will discuss December 2nd, 1961, where he declares himself a Marxist-Leninist and that Cuba will become communist. This is huge because this is how Fidel Castro is seen by the US and other countries, that he is a communist, and that is the mark that he left on Cuba. He also, in that, followed the footsteps of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and that he was a very charismatic leader, which is why he got away with a lot of what he did. So back to my original research question, how did Cuba's political climate contribute to his ascendancy, and what made his revolutionary ideology appealing? Many themes in this. The main themes were that Cuba obviously lacked a strong foundation of national identity, from being part of Spain to being kind of on their own, then having US power. They never were able to form actually who they were. As I just mentioned, he was a very charismatic leader, which helped him and his ideology be appealing to everyone. He was very likable. Another main theme on why the political climate helped Castro get where he was that Cuba lacked likable leaders throughout the years, and they're very open to change, especially coming in from Batista. They did not like that. That was a whole mess, and they were open to really anything else. The resolution of all of this history is that Castro ended up in power, and that is what this all led to. And then the relevance to today is that this all happened very recently. Like I mentioned, Castro came to power in like the 1950s, which is less than 100 years ago. So it is all very relevant to today, and the world and Cuba is still feeling the effects of Castro's rule.